So I'm talking about First Life and the Amazing Cell, and I've actually tried to put a practical application to all of this stuff we're learning tonight at the end. So hopefully I can get to it in the time allotted. And I like the quote from Romans 12:2 about the word from the Bible, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind that you may prove what is good and acceptable. So that's our goal tonight. I did the same thing last week. The reason that I'm doing these teachings really would like to help you strong Christians. I know everyone in the room is a very strong Christian, and you read the Word and you're into the Word and into the prayer. But I just want to give you some confidence and some ammunition for you to go back to the secular world, and when you're being attacked, and oftentimes science, what they call science, is being used as a weapon against you and against Christianity. Just know that there's you have the facts on your side, and you have the truth on your side. More importantly, the truth. So you'll be ready to give a defense to anyone who asks, as 1 Peter, and it's the same question when they're asking you questions. It's the same one that the serpent asked Eve. Did God really say? That's really the question you get asked over and over and over, and you can say, yes, he did. So we trust in the Holy Bible, and the Scriptures are good for inspiration and giving reproof and doctrine for correction and instruction. And I like John 3:12. Jesus' his own words, if I have told you earthly things and you don't believe, how will you believe if I tell you the heavenly things? So these are the earthly things I'm talking about, and maybe a little bit of heavenly things. The sources of my information, I use three primary sources. This slide includes the internet address, the Institute for Creation Research with the late Dr. Henry Morris, and now his son John Morris is carrying on in Dallas, Texas, icor.org. Ken Ham and his organization in northern Kentucky, right near Cincinnati, Ohio, answersingenesis.org, and Dr. Carl Whelan from Australia, a great ministry, and it's creation.com. So all of those websites are treasure troves of information, and whenever you have a question, I usually always read the Bible first, and then I check these organizations for the details. One of the things we didn't talk about last week is the last issue. David has covered biblical creation and evolution. We understand the 6 days of creation by our Lord Jesus Christ. 10 to 6,000 years ago. Evolution teaches billions of years for the creation of the universe, and 4 billion years, 4.3 billion years for the age of the earth. No God, no Allah, no supernatural forces, only time, chance, and death. That's what creates all of the changes that we see in the life system. There's a new player in the field of intelligent design, and this is kind of hard to get your mind around it, because they talk about an intelligent designer. They study the natural world, and they say, with all of this study, all this information, we cannot believe that it's possible to have evolution as the cause of the life forms that we see in the world. But they don't call the designer God, although there are some Christians that are intelligent designers. They're very respected and very intelligent people, but they are not essentially Christians. They avoid that and have attempted a couple of times to try to get intelligent design taught in schools, and that was defeated in the cases that were brought. So you just have to be aware that there's a lot of good information some very respected people in the intelligent design field, but they're not necessarily Christians. So you have to have that as a caveat. Okay, so let's get started. The big question, how did life begin? We're privileged to have the Bible and God's Word, the Holy Spirit with us to let us know what has happened. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And all things were made by Him, in verse 3, and in Him was life. So we have this principle that's called biogenesis. That's not the steroid factory in Florida. It's a concept that says that life only comes from life. So life doesn't come from inanimate objects. And so that's telling us that Jesus Christ is life, and He's the one that's provided all life that we see everywhere. So we're familiar. This is a slide from Answers in Genesis, the 6 days of creation. The important days for us for this talk on how life is formed is day 3, 5, and 6. So I've pulled out the scripture. So day 3, Genesis 1:11, let the earth bring forth grass, the herbs that yield seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind. So day 3, the plants were all formed and trees were formed. Day 5, God created the great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abound according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. So day 5 were the sea-dwelling creatures and the creatures that fly in the air, or maybe even the winged creatures that walk on the ground. And then day 6, God created the beasts of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind, as well as God made man in His own image. So we know that life was created 6,000 to 10,000 years ago on the 3 of the 6 days of creation, and that's our biblical understanding of how we got here. Okay, so let me digress over into the world of science. I should put quotations around that. In science, all living creatures, no matter how simple or complex, are composed of one or more cells. So life is composed of cells. Second thing is life reproduces itself, so it has the ability, life creates life. Life takes on nutrition and excretes waste. So it has to have a way of powering itself and excreting its waste. And fundamentally, life has DNA. So every creature has DNA in its cells, and this is the instruction set. You'll see this over and over. There's some redundancy in some of the videos that I've pulled together, but it's imperative that you understand the DNA is the key to the replication of the cell. So these 2 pictures, excuse me, one is an amoeba on the left. That's a single-cell creature, and it's just about ready to eat this diatom. So that's his lunch, and this over here is a set of human cells. So you can see that, at least from the microscope picture, they look kind of the same. Try to get a scale. So one of the things is, well, how big are these things, and how do we look at them? Cells are basically, if you have any hair, if you pull one out and you hold it up against a white piece of paper, and you look at it with the naked eye, you can see a little dark line there. So that human hair is probably about 50 to 100 micrometers. So that's 50 to 100 millionths of a meter. And cells are about the same size. So the diameter of a human hair in a cell, give or take a little bit, they're about the same size. So that gives you some idea. And really, in order to do cell investigation, you need to have powerful microscopes. The the size of the cell, so I put together a list of items, starting with atoms, molecules, amino acids, proteins, and cells, and the human hair. And over here on the right, I've put the size. And you probably, if you're not dealing with science, micrometers or micrometers are maybe something that you don't use in your daily business life or your activities with your family, unless you're doing homework for your kids. But I've decided to put that in sort of like atomic diameters. So this gives you kind of an idea of the scale, the size of things. So if atoms, I've defined that as 1 unit in diameter, and there are different atoms, obviously over 100 atoms, different kinds of atoms, so there's bigger ones and smaller ones. But if you say an atomic size is 1, then a human hair or a cell would be 1,000,000. So it's 1,000,000 times bigger than an atom. But if you look at molecules, molecules such as water and other molecules, simple molecules, that might be 50 to 100 atomic diameters. If you go to an amino acid, which is an organic molecule, a somewhat complex organic molecule, those are 50 to 100 atomic diameters. And then if you go to a protein is made up a number of amino acids, that might be 500 or 2 to 500 atomic diameters. So you can see that even proteins are much, much smaller than a human hair or a cell because they fit inside the cell, and the proteins are basically the items that do work within the cell. So the proteins are the work performers within the cell. And just again, if you wanted to think of, okay, let's do a scaling. If the Earth, which is around 8,000 miles in diameter, is equal to the size of a cell, then a protein would be the size of Thousand Oaks, the city of Thousand Oaks, a few miles. So it's 8,000 miles versus a few miles. Darwin was at a little bit of a disadvantage in the mid-1800s. Microscopy, the ability to look at things with microscopes was pretty limited. They did have some, and very simple ones with a magnification of probably a few hundred. But now, this is not even probably the most sophisticated one. This is a microscope that uses light, electrons, and ions. They're using different sources of energy in order to image things. And in fact, the state of the art in science is such that we can look at a single atom. There's a machine called an atomic force microscope, and you can actually see pictures if you go on the internet of surfaces composed of atoms. So the technology has moved light years since 1850. But if you look at, the first sentences or the first line is that really the knowledge in the 1800s, people saw these fuzzy blobs under the microscope, and Darwin and his colleagues, scientists thought that it was just a blob of protoplasm. That was what they thought the cell was. And they knew there were cells, but they just thought they were very simple entities. And now, as time has gone on, and even evolutionists will completely agree that the cell is immensely complex. And down at the bottom, it's really filled with what we call nano machines. You may have heard the word used in science lately, nanotechnology, and that means taking a function and building a machine that's actually on the scale of some number of hundreds of atoms or 1,000 of atoms that can perform a function. Like they've made things that are like scissors, where you can go in and you can perform cutting operations at the scale of molecules, where you can cut things out. So there's a whole field. It's something that if you're a young person and you're attracted to science and nanotechnology, I think along with biology, would be wonderful things to take. You don't have a career that'll last you until you're an old person, and you'll never run out of exciting things to study and learn about. So that's one field. But nanotechnology, but when you know it, God was there first. He had to use nanotechnology to make life. That's exactly how life functions, and I'll show you a little bit more as we go on. So, and the other thing, so we know kind of the size of these entities that we're dealing with, cells and proteins and amino acids. Over here, I got Mr. Tebow, who's looking for a job, I think, right now, but he has 1 trillion cells in his body, and as we all do. And the cells are made up of 20 different amino acids, and there are probably over 60,000 proteins in every cell. So I'm telling you, the proteins are the workers in this cell, and you'll see that in the little movie clip coming up. So let me run that.
If simple water molecules that form ice crystals exhibit magnificent structure, consider the design ingenuity behind large, complex molecules, such as DNA. DNA contains the blueprint for all life and is by far the densest information storage mechanism known in the universe. For example, the amount of information contained in a pinhead volume of DNA would fill a stack of books 500 times higher than from here to the moon. The program code and design of such an incredible system indicates a supremely intelligent designer.
The evidence to me that just cries out that there's a God is the study of DNA. DNA is a very powerful, massive information storage system. In fact, DNA that makes up our genes actually is like books of information that's read by a language system. It's absolutely phenomenal. And scientists know today that languages, a code, only come from an intelligence, and information only comes from information. Nobody's ever seen matter by itself give rise to a code. Nobody's ever seen matter by itself give rise to information. And as you look at DNA, it actually cries out, in the beginning, God created the universe.
We all begin as a single cell the size of a period at the end of a sentence. How does that cell know how to build a body with 100 trillion cells in it, thousands of different kinds, and each one of them is so complex, nanochemical machinery beyond our comprehension how it works, and encoded is the instruction manual. It's the manufacturer's manual how to build and operate every part of this incredible body made up of 100 trillion cells.
Furthermore, DNA is a three-dimensional molecule that is self-replicating. Each molecule is able to make an identical copy quickly and efficiently. The Lord has even programmed DNA to detect and correct replication errors. These sophisticated capabilities far exceed man's means.
God has created the DNA molecule in such a way that it is self-correcting. There are special proteins called enzymes that go up and down the DNA molecule looking for and making repairs on a minute-by-minute, second-by-second basis. God created us with a DNA code that actually has what we call editase or editorial type enzymes. Just as an editor reads a newspaper or a book looking for mistakes, so God has created special enzymes that go up and down our DNA molecule, repairing the mistakes in ways that are unbelievably complex.
There are many examples in creation of things that demonstrate the biblical God. One would be in our very DNA. Our DNA has information in it. And there is a whole field of scientific study called information science, which studies how information originates, how it's transmitted, and so on. And one of the laws of information science says that information never originates by itself in matter, never spontaneously comes about. Anytime we trace the copying of information back to its source, it always comes back to a mind. And since we have creative information in DNA, that tells me that DNA comes from intelligence. It's not something that could possibly come about through millions of years of mutations and natural selection. That just won't work.
Yet even the DNA molecule is simple compared to cells. All life consists of cells, and each cell functions as a miniature city. When we consider that a human body consists of trillions of cells working together as one unit, we should be in humble awe of our Creator's intimate care and perfect wisdom.
So all of that's going on in your bodies as we speak. You feel special now? All right. So let me continue. Charles Darwin, in his theory of evolution, he didn't really say in his thesis how first life started, but he claimed it was a single cell organism, and then from then on, his theory of evolution, in his mind, although we disagree strongly in Christianity in this teaching, that everything that we see as animals and plants and bacteria all changed over time due to slow change and death and natural selection. So let me just spend a couple of moments on the complexity and the cell. So the picture on the left is a cross section. It's an optical a microscope picture of a cell. And this is a cartoon drawing of the cell and its many different parts. This is something I took out of a textbook to try to explain. So there's major elements in the cell that perform its functions, although it has myriad subtleties within this cell. Don't have time to go over. That's probably a couple of biology courses taking half a year or a year. But for the cell, you have the important parts, the outer membrane, which contain all of the elements inside the cell. That membrane has to be porous because it wants to let good things in and send bad things out. So it has to take food in and excrete things or pass things out into the other cells that needs to be shared. Also, there's a membrane around the nucleus in an animal cell. There's a nucleus with another membrane that's porous. You'll see that in another video. The nucleus contains all of the instructions and like the central computer for the cell. Then there's the mitochondrion. That is the element that generates the cell's energy. It converts sugars and that into like miniature batteries that get attached to different elements so that the cell has energy to perform its function. The endoplasmic reticulum, that's like the construction area where things are made and passed out into the cell population to be used. And then the Golgi apparatus is like a packing factory where things are packed in certain ways to be used. So highly complex. And in the past, people have likened the cell. This is an article from Newsweek that is describing some of the functions like a factory or a walled city where you have complex transportation systems, you have biological armies to defend the cell from invaders, you have a centralized government with the nucleus and the DNA. So it's very complex, but that doesn't really give you any idea. I've found other explanations, and my belief is it's not like a walled city, like a medieval walled city. It's like a New York City where you have subways ranging to 10 stories below the street level to the tallest building. You've got elevators, people are roaming around, things are being transported, information is being sent. So this is kind of gives you a little feeling about the complexity of the cell. And if you just count parts, so if you're just counting parts, if you look at a Boeing 747 airplane, it has a little over 5 million parts on the blueprints. A cell has billions of parts. So it's thousands of times more complex than a Boeing 747 if you just count the parts, not what they do. And I just took a few pictures here. The micro machines, these are at the atomic level. They're performing functions like information storage, transport of material, allowing certain elements to pass through walls and others not, folding and creating energy. All of these things are happening at the atomic level. And man has, at this point in time, has no ability to do anything near what's being accomplished in the cell. So let me run this little movie for you.
In 1957, Francis Crick first proposed that chemicals called bases along the spine of the DNA molecule function as alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. This animation shows how this digital information directs protein synthesis. First, a large protein complex separates the tightly wound strands of the DNA to prepare it to be copied. During this process of transcription, a protein complex called a polymerase produces a single-stranded copy of the original instructions. Here we see this copy, a messenger RNA molecule, being constructed inside the polymerase as individual bases are positioned and added to the growing strand. Now we see the polymerase in action from the outside as it spits out the messenger RNA transcript. Next, this RNA transcript approaches and passes through a molecular machine called the nuclear pore complex, an information recognition device that controls the flow of information in and out of the cell's nucleus. Now we see the genetic assembly instructions on the messenger RNA approaching and arriving at a two-part chemical factory called a ribosome, the site of protein synthesis. As the messenger RNA transcript passes through the ribosome, the process of translation begins. During translation, a mechanical assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids in accord with the instructions on the transcript. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell by molecules called transfer RNAs, which link specific sequences of bases to corresponding amino acids. The sequential arrangement of the amino acids determines the type of protein constructed. When the construction of the chain is complete, it is transported to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape required to perform its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is released into the outer cytoplasm to do its job in the cell.
Are we impressed yet? Okay, there's more. I'm just getting started over here. Just getting warmed up. Okay, so this is we'll need to talk a little bit more about the DNA. We've heard on a couple of the videos about it. It's obviously you've heard about the double helix. So the molecule is a very, very complex molecule. It's made up of what they call bases, and there are 4 different kinds of bases. Each one, this is the chemical representation for the 4 bases, and each one of those bases forms a step in this ladder. You can see the rungs, the steps, and you see the sides. Let me go to the next one. This one shows it a little bit better. The analogy I have in my mind, it reminds me of a lighthouse stairway. So you've got a curving, the handrails, those are made of sugars and phosphates, atoms and molecules that form the handles. And then the stair steps, the ladder stair steps, are these combinations of these basis pairs. And the interesting thing is, God is so great. Its basis is that A molecules only attach to T, either AT or TA, as it shows, and C's only go with G, so it could be CG or GC. So really, one half of the molecule, if you think about it, since A always goes with T, if you know what the left half is doing, the right half is just a copy. It's a redundant copy. But you don't see how that works in order to make replication of the DNA very easy. It's just, here's another depiction with the helical structure. These are the side rails, the sugars and the phosphines, and then the different rungs of the ladder in the middle. So here's how the replication takes place. So you have the original DNA. I've straightened it out, so now it's not coiled up like a ribbon, but it's flat. So A always goes with T and G goes with C, and so you look at the original. When you want to make a copy, you just pull the left half away from the right half so that you've still got the same information. It's just separated. And then a new replica of the part of the DNA comes in, so the A's and the T's join up, C's and G's. So the old left side comes with a new right side, and the old right side comes with a new left side. And once those two things are formed, you go through, and once you had one DNA molecule, now you have two. The cell can divide, and everything splits in two, and the information that was in the original DNA is carried over flawlessly to the new DNA. Amazing. And there's some other things you'll hear about in genetics with the DNA. You'll hear about chromosomes. Those are just pieces of the DNA wound up, and interestingly, the chromosomes are in the shape of a cross. And here's an SEM picture of chromosomes on a slide. So you see the cross shape. And so the chromosomes are pieces of DNA, and each one of these banded colors, the orange and the black and the yellow and the pink, those represent a gene. And a gene is an instruction, a piece of DNA that gives an instruction that tells the cell how to make the protein. So what you saw in that movie, the DNA pulls apart and the ribosomes, or the messenger RNA gets in there and they do the replication, and then it flies off and gets transported through the nuclear pore membrane and goes out and gets converted into the amino acids that get folded. The protein then gets folded into a certain shape. So this is key. Each one of these is, blue eyes, brown hair, tall, short, susceptible to sickle cell anemia or other, all of the traits that we have in our human genome. But the interesting thing is, if I can stop that from rotating, the protein on the right, it needs the DNA in order to make the protein, like the movie told you. But the protein, or the DNA itself, needs proteins in order to do that repair and all of that. So it's a chicken and the egg conundrum. You can't have a protein without DNA, and you can't have DNA without a protein. So they both had to be created simultaneously by God in the beginning to make everything in life work. So you need to have that. So one of the things down here is the requirement that you need to have both elements at once. So the letters of the alphabet are this A, T, C, G, and that's if anybody is into computers, you know that in computer languages you have ones and zeros. You've probably heard the term binary. So it's either a 0 or a 1. It isn't a 0.5 or a 2. It's always 0 and 1 in the computer language, like ASCII. The ASCII code is zeros and ones. In God's communication, he uses 4 letters, A, C, T, and G, and then the word he forms is a 3-letter word. So it's called a condon. And so the condon specifies what the amino acid is. So I'm familiar in electrical engineering. We have things that are called lookup tables. So it gives you a code. You take the code and you run over and you compare it to all of the other things. Oh, here's an exact match. So it tells you what you're supposed to do. That's used in cellular communication theory. But here they've gone through and they've found, so if you've got GCA, as we have in this example, then you go look GCA down here and it tells you, oh, I make this, this is amino acid that's called ALA. So that's one type of amino acid. Oh, if I have TGG, then it's some other kind of amino acid. So it's just the cells can tell which amino acids they're making with this 3-letter word. And so, summary, so ACTG are the coding elements. The condon is every 3 bases, so like CAT would be one kind of amino acid, and then you take several of these amino acids and you build a protein with it, and then the protein goes out and gets folded, so it has a shape. So that's the letters, and if you think that mutations help, think of the sentence. This is kind of a weird sentence, but it's got 3 letters in every word. The cat ate the dog. Maybe if you're a dog lover, you don't like it. But if you take the H out, if you make a mistake and remove the H, then you got this gibberish down here. So just by changing one letter in a code, you know, people say in science, well, the chimpanzee has the same DNA as humans to 98%. That 2% makes a big difference. So a big difference. So every element of the code, and as you saw in the movie, it even has what's in electrical engineering, I call it error correction. So if you have a code and there's a mistake, that enzyme goes along and fixes that, so it repairs the errors so that it's making that DNA for the replication. You know, it's not only are you building your children by having your wife and yourself donate to make a single cell to start life, but just replicating yourself. Your cells are always dying, so you're building cells like crazy all the time. Some cells live for a matter of hours and some live for months, but they're all being replaced as you live your life. So you have to live, you have to make those cells. So it's critically important to every human being. So we've seen the DNA replication, we've seen the transcription by the RNA, and we've seen the proteins that come out, then get folded. One of the things that's really intriguing to me is shape matters. Not only did God use the letters and the sequence of the letters and the amino acid sequences and proteins, he folds. You saw that one depiction where the protein is being folded into a shape. It's like a key. How do the proteins know where to go? Well, they go where they fit. So it's like a key. If you're keying to open a lock, you have a shape that's required when you insert the key to fit the tumbler so that you can turn the lock and open the door. The proteins have the same function. Their shape, when they go to be used in the cell, they have to fit perfectly where they're going, or they won't perform the function. So that's another one of the impossibilities, how these cells could self-replicate themselves into the precise shape that's needed to be used in the rest of the cell. And this was kind of an interesting thing. There's a material called laminin in the body. It's actually not inside the cell, but it's a material that is used to attach cells together. So like your skin cells, you have this material outside the cells in order to hold them apart, or you'd fall apart. And this shape is a very familiar shape to us Christians. It's a cross, and the nodes of that actually attach, the cross-shaped arms attach and link so that it forms sheets. So things like your lungs, your heart, your skin, any place where you need to contain things, your liver, these are glue. Essentially, these proteins act as glue elements in order to hold your cells together. And so there's a number of people that have identified this in the past, and this is from Colossians. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So we know God created us, but he's also holding us together. So that's an interesting sidelight. So shape plays an important part in the biology of human life. There's also a thing called chirality. This is another one of the impossibilities. So if you look at your hands, they look the same. They sort of match. But the only thing is this thumb is going that way and this thumb is going that way. So there's a left-handed and right-handedness is something that's found in nature and also in hockey sticks, parenthetically. Left-handed and right-handed baseball gloves. So there's handedness to the cell. And what you find out is that you can make these organic molecules, and because you're looking at where the hydrogen is, like your thumb, it can be on the left side or it can be on the right side. But when you look at life, the amino acids that are used in the proteins are only left-handed. Only left-handed. And when you do an experiment, you do a chemistry experiment to generate something by a natural means, by creating a reaction with something. When you make these materials, you get equal amounts of left-handed and right-handed material. So life has a property that in the proteins, you're only using the left-handed ones. So lefties, you coming through for us. This is another, just show you different molecule. So in any experiment where you're trying to create things in the lab, you're not going to get only left-handed molecules. And then people talk about mutations, and you might have a mutation due to maybe infrared energy coming in or damaging the DNA. How can that improve things? You know, when you're talking about a mutation, I had some pictures of animals that were mutated and I took it down. I just didn't, I didn't want to make everybody sick. But it's like taking a book. Take the Bible. Go ahead, mark out words, cut holes in it, take out sentences. Does that make it better? Are you making it better? Not. You're not or Shakespeare or any book. You're not making it better by randomly putting and taking away words and letters from what you've written. God knew what he was doing. And even Bill Gates, when you look at the DNA molecule, it is a computer code, basically, that's far, far more advanced. Far, far more advanced than anything he and Microsoft have ever created. So, there's a lot of comparisons that had one in the video about how much information is stored. An amount of DNA just on the head of a pin would go to the moon and back many, many hundreds of times, or create stacks of compact disc recordings with so much information. So let me take a few minutes. I'm going to go through the So what does science teach? What are the possibilities that science teaches in evolution? And David, you could correct me if there's other ones. There's a million subsets of this. You look in the science books. I was able to get a biology book from high school, Thousand Oaks High School, and look through it. But to see what the possibilities are, let's sort of walk through them. So the first one is spontaneous generation. This was popularized, from the time of Aristotle up through probably through the Middle Ages. And this is where people would see something that was maybe dirty clothing or something, and then come back a couple of days later. If you have a teenage son and you're finding bugs crawling in it, the bugs didn't just spontaneously appear. Or if you see a puddle of water and you come back a day or two later and you see little tadpoles or something swimming around in the water, the people didn't think of birds flying over and dropping things, seeds or other bacteria or other items into the water. So the idea of spontaneous generation, where it means life comes from nothing. It just spontaneously appears out of nowhere. That was long ago refuted by Dr. Reddy and also Louis Pasteur. Did experiments and is well accepted that spontaneous generation is not the way that life is formed. And as Rob McCoy, our pastor, tells us often, the worldwide food industry is based on the principle that living things only come from living things. So you don't open a jar of hermetically sealed peanut butter and find living things in there. The next one is what they call the primordial soup theory. And so this has a lot of different aspects to it, but basically it's saying this is a scientist with his primordial soup. He's working in the lab and he's saying to himself, if I can only create life, then I will prove no intelligence was necessary. So it's a joke. But basically it's trying to think of early Earth and what might have been the chemicals in that. I won't spend much time on it because it too has been pretty much refuted. There was an experiment done, I think, in 1953 by Miller and Urey that's referenced, and this was in the textbook I looked in high school. Is this experiment still in your textbook? So this is an experiment that's also quoted. It's an experiment where these scientists put water, methane gas, ammonia, and hydrogen into a sealed system. It had a lot of features. It had a trap, and it essentially was directed at saying, well, those were the early components that were on the Earth, chemicals, and then they passed an electrical discharge through it. I have a movie that speaks to it better, but they claim that there were some amino acids that were created, and so those were the, quote, building blocks of life that everybody then was taught was the genesis of life. So let me play this whole movie.
A good example of negative evidence is the 1953 Origin of Life experiment by Stanley Miller, the one that helped lead me into atheism in the first place. As biologist Jonathan Wells explained to me, Miller's experiment has now been thoroughly discredited.
Stanley Miller put together a glass apparatus, and in that apparatus he put a mixture of gases that people at the time thought reflected the atmosphere of the early Earth. And those gases were methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor. But then the professional opinion of what was there on the early Earth changed. In the 60s, geochemists revised their hypothesis and decided that the hydrogen, being very light, would have escaped into outer space. The Earth's gravity isn't strong enough to hold it. And probably the early Earth's atmosphere then consisted of what we now see coming out of volcanoes today. namely carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water vapor. Well, if the early Earth's atmosphere consisted of those gases, then Stanley Miller's experiment would not work. In fact, he himself tried it with those gases, and he found that he couldn't produce any amino acids at all. So the experiment falls apart once you use a more realistic mixture of gases in the apparatus.
Miller's test has been repeated many times using the correct atmospheric components. The results are always the same. The amino acids that generated so much enthusiasm in 1953 do not appear.
Even if Miller's experiment were valid, you're still light years away from making life. It comes down to this. No matter how many molecules you can produce with early Earth conditions, plausible conditions, you're still nowhere near producing a living cell. And here's how I know. If I take a sterile test tube and I put in it a little bit of fluid with just the right salts, just the right balance of acidity and alkalinity, just the right temperature, the perfect solution for a living cell, and I put in it one living cell. This cell is alive. It has everything it needs for life. Now I take a sterile needle and I poke that cell, and all its stuff leaks out into this test tube. You have in this nice little test tube all the molecules you need for a living cell. Not just the pieces of the molecules, but the molecules themselves. And you cannot make a living cell out of them. You can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So what makes...
I think that's a tremendous depiction there, where you have all of the molecules for life. You can speculate about this molecule, but you take a living organism, you poke a hole in it, all the stuff, he says, leaks out, and you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So all of these experiments to try to create life with electricity and amino acids and that from early Earth conditions are basically just, impossible. So I just wanted to, so basically the Miller experiment that was done and is still quoted from 1953, gee whiz, you would think that they would have gotten further along in 60 years, right? We've gone 60 years since that experiment. It's still quoted as the definitive experiment. The amino acids, no way to make proteins because it's missing all of the other elements of the cell factory, and proteins without DNA for the information mechanism, there's no way. So that's another one of my 10 impossibilities up here. And as I said, there's a myriad of different nuances. People are talking about geothermal vents and microbes that can live at exceedingly high temperatures. It still doesn't change any of the chemistry. It just means that there are some creatures that God made to live in very harsh conditions. That's the way I look at it. And then there's these calculations of odds. Okay, well, given enough time, there's a lot of times you hear these statements about, time is the hero in the story of evolution. We have all of these billions or millions of years, and chance must have made this molecule. So just using this simple idea of a bicycle lock, if you have 10 digits that you have to correctly align in order for the bicycle lock to open, you've got 4 dials, so that's 10 digits times 4 dials is 10 to the 4th or 10,000 combinations. If you had a bicycle lock, if you lived in a really rough neighborhood, not in Thousand Oaks, you have 10 dials, and you have that would be 10 billion possibilities. So it would take a thief a long time unless he probably get frustrated and just cut the lock off. But if you have a combination of taking 20 amino acids and they have to be lined up in 150 different sites, and all of that has to be in the right order, now you're talking about 1 times 10 to the 195th. So That's a scientific notation. But just to give you some idea, there are reputed to be about 10 to the 80th elementary particles in the universe. So you're talking about 10 to the 115th universes you would have to gather to just have enough things, protons, electrons, and neutrons, to equal that possibility. Absurd. It's absurd. I think I'll skip that one because it's kind of long. But Ben Stein, if you've ever watched you can go on the internet and get a look at his DVD called Expelled, and it has a lot of interesting information. And the scientific community is basically very harsh against people who are talking about creation or intelligent design. Even intelligent design people have been fired and released from universities. So there was another idea. This is another way that life could form, and this was proposed by a fellow named Dean Kenyon from San Francisco State University, a very well-known professor. He had the theory that the chemicals, just the chemical attraction, would cause these molecules to form themselves. It was really, this work was done in a time frame when DNA and the importance of DNA really hadn't become widely known. And he wrote a book, and everybody was very excited about this biochemical predestination, where it was just the attractive forces of these chemical bonds that would form life. Ultimately, he abandoned that, and he abandoned it so badly that he now is intelligent. He works for the people in the intelligent design area, saying that this is such an impossibility that his original theory, he was man enough to stand up and say, my original theory was totally wrong. So he came over, at least to the intelligent design side. I don't know if he's a Christian or not. I have a couple of videos there. I'm running late, so I need to jump through those. These will all be available through the internet. Then the final one, this one I like, it's called panspermia theory. And our friend, the atheist spokesperson that appears everywhere that he possibly can, has written a book called The God Delusion. Mr. Richard Dawkins, he has this quote in one of his writings. It's absolutely safe to say that if you meet someone who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, or all of the above. So that's where he's coming from. I will play this because it's such a hoot.
In the book.
Well, then who did create the heavens?
This is Ben Stein's movie.
Why do you use the word who? You see, you immediately beg the question by using the word who.
Well, then how did it get created?
Well, by a very slow process.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
What was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, and how did that happen?
I told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anybody.
Nor has anyone else. What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility.
I don't know if Ben Stein's falling asleep or reading his notes.
If you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology, you might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
Well,
but that higher intelligence would itself have had to have come about by some explicable or ultimately explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point.
So Professor Dawkins was not against intelligent design, just certain types of designers, such as God. So that
Ben Stein, he's a TV personality. He writes for many magazines, columnist. Yeah, he's been in some movies, a TV show. Comedian, yeah. He's got that dry sense of humor. So this is also Francis Crick. He's he's from the Watson and Crick fame of the DNA, understanding the DNA molecule. He's also a very highly committed atheist, and so I'll run a little bit of his.
Nobel Prize winner Francis Crick published an extraordinary book called Life Itself, in which he argues from a scientific point of view that life, the DNA molecule, which is the essence of life, could not have got started by accident on this planet. He didn't believe it could. He compared it to, he said it's about as likely that, this idea of the primeval soup and molecules accidentally bumping against each other, producing life, which so many of our scientists like.
Sure.
Crick compared that to, thought that was about as likely as the assembly of a fully functioning jumbo jet by a hurricane in a junkyard. It is just such an extraordinarily complicated molecule, the DNA molecule, and its relationship to the proteins equally complicated. So to cut a long story short, he suggested it was sent here by an alien civilization from the other side of the universe who faced certain doom, perhaps, as a result of a supernova explosion. They sought to preserve the essence of life, and so they sent bacteria out into the universe in spaceships loaded with DNA. Those bacteria, one of those spaceships crashed into the early Earth. This theory is Crick's theory. It's called directed panspermia.
Okay, so this is the guy that was the inventor. And then we've got this character. This is another atheist that has quite a bit of exposure on some of the television channels, Eric von Daniken.
A young man's spiritual journey.
I was a boy, 16 years old, when I said, this is not God. What are we talking about?
A controversial bestseller.
I was mesmerized by it. I couldn't put it down.
And a scientific theory that threatened to change the world.
Everything was turned upside down.
Okay, enough of that. So basically what they're telling us... No! The aliens did it. There we go. We got one of these guys from Mars attacks, and so what do you want to believe? A self-existent God who created everything, or a space alien that seeded the Earth? That's basically these are the people that are supposed to be the wise men of our age, telling us how life came to be. So I've got a few minutes. I wanted to tack a couple of things. One is in one of the videos you heard Ken Ham talking about this information problem. And so basically what he's saying is really there's no scientific evidence that any natural process, the science is defined in our classrooms now talk only about natural process. There's no natural process that can create a sequence of letters for a language, or a sequence of characters, or a graphical language, or machine code that has information content. So what does that mean? Okay, look at a tornado, or you might look at the flashing of a lightning strike or a bunch of lightning strikes, or you study maybe the novas as you look through a giant telescope in outer space, or you look at a rippling river as it falls down over a series of stairs, and you record the sounds, and you try to look for patterns of information that are being spewed out by these natural events, and you'll never find them. You'll never find them. because it doesn't create information. But humans, we create information all the time. The Rosetta Stone, hieroglyphics, the New York Times, I guess that's information. It may not be the information you want, but...
You didn't say truth.
The truth, yes. It's information, maybe disinformation. But the definition of information has 4 properties. One is it has a code. So there's letters or symbols that are a code. There's meaning, so the receiver of that code understands what those symbols represent. Like the Rosetta Stone, we needed that to be able to understand hieroglyphics and other languages. There's an expected action from the information, and there's a purpose. So let me just jump through here. So this is essentially examples of some codes: the English, French, German, languages, hieroglyphics, or we have these computer codes based on the ones and zeros that represent maybe letters of the alphabet or mathematical equations, and then the DNA down here with its 3-letter words that are describing how life is to be made. And the one thing that's interesting is we have the first law of thermodynamics that says mass and energy. So we've got Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. So we know that mass and energy are interchangeable. Sometimes if you create energy, it's a big explosion, but mass and energy. And when God finished his work on the 6th day, that says that was all of the mass and energy that has been given to the universe. And we can't add or subtract any. We can change it, but we can't add any. But with information, so it says mass energy can't be created or destroyed. But with information, I can write a sentence on a board, say, the police are coming to this building in 5 minutes, and then I take an eraser and I erase that information, and the information is gone. So if somebody hadn't seen that whiteboard that says the police are coming here in 5 minutes, they wouldn't know it. So information can be destroyed. It can be created and it can be destroyed, but it can only be created by an intelligent mind. Just give you an example, how compact and how powerful the DNA is. The DNA molecule has a packing density 5 billion times more compact than the most sophisticated hard drive. And if you look at the information content, if you covered a postage stamp with DNA, there would be 7.7 million Bibles. That's 7.7 times 10 to the 12th Bibles of information on that postage stamp. So let me just finish off here with one important fact. DNA is information, like Ken Ham said. This is probably the most powerful, other than the last one where God told us his word in the Bible. This is probably the most powerful attribute of DNA that we can say it demands God's hand. It demands God's being to create this information. So we know in DNA it has a code, the 4 letters, ACTG. It has words that are comprised of those 3 letters. Those 3-letter words, the codon, represent one of 20 different amino acids. The action is the cell makes the proteins for construction and maintains reproduction in the whole organism, and then the purpose is the existence of life. So we have a sender who is God, and the recipient is the living organism. And that's absolute proof that it has to be intelligent designer, and we call him Yahweh or Jesus Christ. So this is the summation. Living creatures contain DNA. DNA meets the definition of information. Therefore, DNA must be created by intelligence. I have in the presentation, which if you want to get on the disk, 10 subsets that I go through. I'm going to skip over those because there's some interesting things at the end that I want to show a practical example. So evidence of God is you're without excuse, the human DNA. Now this is funny. This is two people. So here's the astronomy department on your left-hand side. He's saying, any day now, we're going to pick up a tiny coded signal. Then we'll know for certain that there's intelligence out there because coded information does not arise by chance. And then you walk down the biology department, this guy's saying, the precisely coded information in the cell could fill many books, but we know for certain that no intelligence was involved in created life. They had to get together. Let me try to be practical for the last 10 minutes or so and show you. There's something that I found and I prayed about it and talked to Marty and a couple of people, and so I'm going to tell you about it. Obviously, I'm not a health food freak. You know, I'm not a greenie. I enjoy my barbecue, etc., like Pastor Rob. But there's something called genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. How many people have heard of GMOs? Okay, so most everybody's heard of these. Let me show you what a GMO is. This is being used in our food supply right now. And one of the types of GMOs that's used is the people at Monsanto have found that if they take a portion of the DNA, so now we're engineering with DNA of bacteria that essentially causes parasites for the plant to die, and you use a technique with enzymes to do a splicing, so you remove part of the DNA of a host, say a cotton or a corn. You can take that DNA slice and create something that wasn't natural. This is something that wasn't made by God. It's made by man. And the idea is that by taking that bacteria DNA, you can actually put into the corn or cotton a material that if the pests eat the material, then they'll die. So you don't need to spray pesticides on. So that's the rationale. So that's why is it wonderful? But the thing is, there's some very, very troubling science behind this, where for many years there have been information developed, and I just picked one from quite recently, that these GMO feeds have a destructive capability with the pigs that get fed this material, and they've done it with genetically modified potatoes and rats, and they found that there's problems. And the particular way this works is that the way it kills the bacteria, or the way it kills the pests, is that it destroys the pest's stomach. So the pest, whatever's eating the corn or the cotton, and it's been applied to soy and other things, it destroys their stomach, so that pest dies. But they've gotten pictures of stomachs lining from different animals that have been tested with this, and it does show a very rapid growth, and one of the people who looked at it said it looked precancerous. And one of the things that struck me, and I have a video but I don't have time to play it, is that the stomach problems. You go to a restaurant nowadays and they ask you, do you want the gluten-free menu or do you want the regular menu? Where did gluten intolerance come from? Marty, was there gluten intolerance in the 20s and 30s? Did you get a gluten-free menu? We're having irritable bowel syndrome. We have a lot of ulcers and other things. I'm not an advocate or a shill or anything. The thing that I'm seeing, though, is I'm seeing that man has taken God's place in this DNA, and put information into the cell of things that we consume, like corn and soybeans and that. I'm just asking you to think about it, okay? I'm not advocating anything. In my talk, I have some places you can go and look. As with everything, you need to consider that. There's also one other thing I found. This was sent to me by a Christian organization. There's this company called 23andMe, and it's basically for $99 you can get a reading of your DNA. The only problem is, like it says down here, you only get 0.3% of your genetic material analyzed, and it would probably cost $30,000 to do a deeper sequencing of your genome. But what this has brought to my mind is I heard the other day that Angelina Jolie has actually had a double mastectomy based on the fact that her genome, when she was analyzed, she had a high risk for breast cancer. Now, maybe that's the right thing to do, or maybe that's not the right thing to do. But again, I'm saying there's elements here that we're living in a very fast-paced scientific world, and things are changing very rapidly, and people like cloning, which was a big thing years ago, and stem cell research, you don't hear about it, but it's still going on. They're still killing embryos for the stem cells around the world, and this is absolutely something that is anti-God's word, in my humble opinion. So with that, I'll leave you, any new ideas when you come to evaluate them. You have, the time-tested way of prayer, reading the Bible, and then asking the Holy Spirit to direct you to do the right thing. So when you look at these new things that are coming out in science and this biological area that we were talking about tonight, consider that. I thank you. That's my message for tonight.